Hello, today I'm going to take you through my portfolio overview for designing the Be Well app. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible, but no promises that I'll be able to do it in 5 minutes, but let's try. So first, let's discuss the project goal. I was presented with a very general brief. Essentially, the brief was an app that enables users to instantly chat to experts within essentially any field. So this was a very wide scope and I had a lot of creative agency, so I decided to interpret it as a product within the field of mental health and well-being, and I chose this direction primarily because I have a real interest in this area of mental health and well-being, and so designing a product within that area seemed very interesting and engaging to me. And also I am a real strong proponent of democratizing mental health for everyone, and I feel like technology and apps are a real fruitful and effective way of doing this. So I was really excited to start this project. So the product that I designed, to give you a quick overview, is, like I said, called Be Well. It's primarily a platform that connects users with a suitable mental health professional for online therapy. So here you see a brief overview of some of the main screens. And I incorporated a design process framework, design thinking process, like many other UX designers, and this would help me basically focus on prioritizing finding the best solution for the users throughout the design process. And because it's iterative, I was able to build insights later on in the design process and implement them retrospectively. And here you have an overview of the design process framework that I used. And we'll be briefly touching upon each of these phases: understand, observe, point of view, ideate, prototype and test within the portfolio overview. So without further ado, we'll go to the first phase, which is understand. And the first aspect of the whole process was creating a problem statement. So the problem statement that I came up with was: the user needs a way to access a mental health therapist easily and discreetly at an affordable price through an app because they want to seek therapy to improve their mental health. And then we will know this to be true when we see that our user is successfully, consistently and comfortably using the app to have therapy sessions. So, in order to understand beyond the problem statement, I then needed to understand the competitive landscape. So I did a SWOT profile analysis of two of the main competitors within the online therapy industry, and they were BetterHelp and Talkspace. So I was able to analyse their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and deduct really interesting insights, opportunity areas and potential threats, so areas that they're doing very well in, through this analysis. And then we go on to the second stage of the design process, which is observe. The first stage of this was user research, so I needed to conduct actual research with real users so that I could understand their attitudes, behaviours and needs, so that I could create a relevant and applicable product. So here are some details of the interview details, and then the goals of the research, essentially 19 questions so that I could understand and identify different features, attitudes, frustrations within the user experience. And then from this I collated all the data and I organised it using affinity mapping into categories: behaviour and attitudes, goals and needs and frustrations. And then from that I further organised the data into a series of affinity maps with specific headings that kind of naturally came from my affinity mapping process, and these were communication channels, therapy offers, proposed app features, finding a therapist, and fears about using the therapy app. So this was a really, really informative and insightful part of the design process, because I was able to better understand the user's motivations and maybe discover valuable features in this stage of the process. So moving on from that, I then created some user personas based on the research findings that I had. So I developed 3 personas, as you can see below here: Bart, James and Mia. and they were essentially representing a archetypical user whose goals and characteristics present the needs of those that I would classify as the main demographic for the app. So they touched upon 3 different kind of subclasses within this demographic. So someone that had, like Bart, who has a lot of experience with therapy, maybe not online therapy, but definitely therapy as a concept. Then we have James, who has very little understanding of therapy and is quite apprehensive of the whole concept of online therapy. And then we have Mia, who's quite well seasoned and has a very specific need for her therapist. She knows exactly what she wants. So once we had our user personas identified and developed, we moved on to the ideate phase of the process. So the first phase of this is creating user journey maps. So this allowed me to visualize the process that a potential user would go through in order to complete a specific task. So again, we have Bart, James, and Mia. And yes, I really enjoyed this phase of the process. You're able to really understand the task, the emotion and the opportunities that come up with these hypothetical users. And it really helps you to understand, to empathize with the user and then really visualize how the process could look in real time. So after this, I moved on to the task analysis and user flows phase. So when I had my user flows personas developed, I was able to, based on the data that I gathered, identify 3 important tasks that my personas would want to be able to complete in the app. And from that, I could determine an entry point, so the starting point in the app, and then the success criteria, so how we could measure success on completion of the task. And through this, I created 3 user flows, as you can see below. So for this user flow, the specific task was to a therapist match via a questionnaire. And then task 2, browse and select a therapist, so not using the questionnaire. And then task 3 was booking a therapy session. So after I had my 3 user flows developed, I developed a sitemap. So this would help me to visualize the hierarchy rather than the flow between the pages, how the pages are prioritized, linked and labeled. So really how I understand it is that user flows are street view details and the sitemaps are bird's eye views. And once I had this in place, I understood the foundational structure of some of my app. I then went on to the card sorting phase of the design process. So this allowed me to test the hierarchy and links between the pages, so to see if my user flow and sitemaps were actually correct or if they needed some iteration based on real experience. So I created a card sorting tool and then presented it and had 7 participants comment and change how they thought the hierarchy would interplay. So here you can see the categories, cards and the technical facts, and then using a placement matrix I was able to deduct my results and build potential changes based upon these results. So here's my analysis and changes. And then we went on to the prototype phase. So now that we've done and gathered user input and we've created a matrix and built some improvements upon that, I started to wireframe and prototype. So first I started with low to mid fidelity wireframes, focusing on the 3 core features that were featured in the task flows earlier. That is scheduling a video therapy session, browsing the therapist pool with keyword search bar, and having a video therapy session. And I use Balsamiq to create these kind of low to mid fidelity prototypes. And from that, I was then able to build a high fidelity prototype using Adobe. which I could then use in my usability testing and reporting. So this was a super important aspect of my design process. I feel like no design process is complete without extensive usability testing, because it is integral to maintaining your empathetic and objective side as a UX designer. So, a quick overview: I conducted a total of 6 usability tests, and each of the participants were recruited from my personal network. And they were asked to complete core tasks and think out loud as they went along, so that I could take notes and analyse their interactions with the app, and then make deductions from that. And the overall test objectives were to test the core functions, being, again, signing up, logging in, browsing the therapist pool, booking a therapy session, and starting a video therapy session. So I gathered all the data from these extremely useful user tests, and from that I organised the data into positive quotes, negative quotes, observations, and errors through affinity mapping and then from that I could organise my data into a mobile usability rainbow spreadsheet, and then rank the severity error using Jacob Nielsen's 4-step scale. And this was extremely useful in order to be able to prioritise and determine what are real issues and what are just aesthetic blips, for instance. So, based on my results in the rainbow spreadsheet, I could take all the high severity issues and create design iterations based on the results, so I could fix the issues before we had to develop the product further. So here are some examples of iterations that I made based on my usability test results and the Nielsen results. So for instance here, the feedback from all the participants was that the chat icon here was unclear and unintuitive. So based on that, I had to rename the chat icon to sessions and therapy, or therapy, and then create a video icon or include a video icon with the chat icon. So this is really important feedback, and it really helped me to hone in on my design and make improvements before we got too deep into the design process. So after this, we moved on to polishing the design based on peer feedback and accessibility considerations. So I was lucky in the sense that I had the ability and opportunity to test my design on my peers within Career Foundry, and they provided me excellent feedback, which is detailed below. I think one of the most interesting and important feedbacks that they gave me was this particular example. So based on the feedback, all my peers considered this button formation as misleading. It looked to them more like a token or something that they couldn't press, which is a really severe and important oversight. So based on their feedback, I changed the button design to something that's more traditional and easily recognisable. It was really interesting for me to receive that feedback, because I guess I reflected and saw that maybe my design decisions before were based more on aesthetic and maybe creating like an individual design rather than a functional design focused more on usability, which is something that UX designers should always prioritise. So yeah, here are more examples of iterations that I imposed due to feedback, which is testament to how beneficial and useful feedback is, and how important it is to incorporate other people's opinions into your design. And then we are left with the final design. Here's a quick overview. I chose a calm, simplistic palette, really just a specific light green and light blue. I wanted to keep it as like within the realm of calm design as much as possible, but there's such a pattern of UX designers using white backgrounds for therapy apps at the moment that I took the decision to use a light green to give it a little bit of a design, like an individualistic design angle, and also so that it wouldn't look as much like a therapy app, which is something that I'll discuss later on in the interview questions. So lastly, the design system. So the whole UI design system constantly evolved during the design process. I iterated so many times in terms of the actual UI and the overall structure of the app. But it's so important to keep a consistent and updated documentation of the final UI elements in the design system. So here it is below. And there I included colours, grid system, components with multiple subcategories under, and language and tone. So it was important that the voice should be human with calm, comforting, understanding and friendly tone for B-Well. And lastly, typography. So that's everything for my portfolio review. I hope you enjoyed it. And now I will quickly run through 4 of the interview questions that were provided through B-Well. So the first very interesting interview question was, have I ever given feedback on someone else's design? Most definitely. I've given feedback on a number of my Career Foundry peers on their high fidelity designs. And my feedback centered around usability, navigation, accessibility standards. And it's just super important to provide honest and constructive feedback to other designers' designs, because at the end of the day, you have to retain objectivity throughout your design process, and gaining other people's insights is a great way to reinforce that stance. But I'm always very considerate of the fact that it's someone's design. You have to make sure that your feedback is professional and constructive and isn't influenced too much by your own taste. Okay? Let's say I don't like a colour or a certain image. It's not really the UX focus, right? So you have to ensure that, it's constructive and useful and also generalised. So, and then, have I ever received feedback on one of my own designs? Yes, again, I received a lot of feedback from my peers at Career Foundry when we were conducting the peer reviews, and also from my personal network when I conducted the usability tests for my B-Well app. Again, I was able to gather a ton of really interesting insights around usability and contrast issues, which helped me gain a better understanding of accessibility standards. Both feedback sessions just gave me excellent insights and suggestions around layout, visibility, and instances, like I discussed earlier, of misleading or confusing design, like my confusing login sign-in button formation. I incorporated some of the feedback that they gave me, and it really helped to polish and improve my design. However, I was aware of the fact that some feedback is influenced by personal taste, and you have to be aware of that, and you have to be comfortable with rejecting some feedback if you feel like it's not particularly applicable or valid. The feedback process is so important to me because it really reinforces, like I said, and reminds me that I'm not my user, which is such an important mantra within the UX community, and it helps me to design from a place of empathy and objectivity. And then obviously it helps to build resilience because you have to constantly remind yourself to retain professionalism and detach yourself slightly from your own design because it is being critiqued and see it as a professional opportunity to grow. I mean, if you're going to be a UX designer, you have to understand and acknowledge and appreciate that the whole UX design process is centered around iteration. So if you're not open to change, then you're not going to be able to mold and fit within this kind of design framework. So yeah. And then how would my teammates describe me professionally? So to try and maintain as much humility as possible, I feel like firstly they'd think that I was a good listener. I always think that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, and that within the UX design sphere, being a good listener is paramount to success. You have to understand the problem, and by understanding the problem, you have to listen to so many different people's perspectives, from stakeholders to potential users, etc. And listen and absorb and build on their feedback. So yeah, I feel like good listening is essential and often a skill overlooked in the modern workplace. And then apart from that, I'd say they would consider me pragmatic and solutions focused. I generally would rather focus on fixing a problem rather than focusing on why the problem occurred in the first place. And then lastly, analytical, creative, definitely, but with an analytical insight or edge, because I have 6 years of experience working in category management, which required a lot of analysis and number crunching. So it helped me to gain skills and insight in the more practical, mathematical, analytical aspect of UX design. So yeah, I think that's how I would be described. And then question of have I had a difficult project and how have I overcome a challenge? I think when creating this Be Well app, I had quite a few issues or challenges, interesting challenges, which I had to find a solution for. One in particular that springs to mind is, so we were trying to make a therapy app that is discreet so that no one, like no onlookers, would really know that it was a therapy app. And this was motivated mainly by strong feedback by some of our potential users about their discomfort with using therapy app in public, and their concerns around privacy and people knowing that they are having therapy. So we needed to achieve a discreet design. And in order to do this, we imposed a number of measures. So we opted for a very muted, calm palette, not to draw attention. But we didn't go for white, because we've noticed within the online mental health sphere, a lot of mental health providers have a white background, and it just kind of gives an impression of, we just wanted to be different. So we used a light green. And apart from that, we used, for instance, the actual name is called Be Well. We didn't want to have any clear connotations like BetterHelp or Talkspace. We didn't want any too obvious connotations with therapy, so we thought Be Well could maybe be interpreted as mental, like wellness. And also the logo that we used is quite discreet. It's not necessarily, it's just a smiling face. So it disguises the therapy aspect of the app to an extent. Apart from that, we also didn't really use the term therapy or therapist. Well, we tried to use it to a minimum within the app. And also in the bottom navigation, originally we were going to bunch the chat and the video icon under therapy, but we didn't want a permanent icon named therapy because we thought it would be too obvious. So instead we broke them out, said chat and messaging, to try and just make it quite a general app that wouldn't necessarily shout therapy app to onlookers. So that's one example. And then lastly, in terms of questions that I would ask my employer, so I think the most important one, something I'd be really interested to know is, I know, and as you know, the UX design process is extremely cross-functional. It requires cooperation from a ton of different teams. And I'd be interested to know how you would ensure that input from all these different teams, designers, developers, etc., marketing, are valued equally. How would you ensure that different teams and different teams' objectives aren't valued more, or different teams aren't able to bulldoze their agenda above others? How do you keep essentially a flat hierarchy within this cross-functional, the cross-functional nature of this role? Okay, and that is everything. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my BUL portfolio overview and interview questions.